Yeah, you guys are live. Hi, Josh.
Great for you guys. Pass it down. Good luck on your posters tomorrow.
Yeah, I did a lot of
Just wanted to talk to you about the draft for the textbook.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, if you can send it electronically, that
Oh
also.
yeah, sure. That's okay.
Perhaps just share. Oh, Bakiza, do you want to make a quick announcement about your event?
That'd be amazing if I
Yeah,
could.
go ahead. I don't have all the details about the location and time, so I figure you're better off making it.
Perfect. I'll make it quick.
Sure, it's okay. Yeah, it doesn't have to be that quick.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I hope you guys are doing well so far, surviving the stress season. I just wanted to make a quick announcement on behalf of NOS, the Neuroscience Student Association for Undergrad students. We have an event tomorrow. It's pretty cool. It's the neurobiology of meditation and motivation. So we're going to be learning from Dr. Paul Whistle and what a PhD student from Dr. Derek Von Der Koy. He did a really great research in U of T about what happens in our brains when we are meditating and how mice are, um, how drugs can affect like motivation through opioids. So it's from a very unique perspective. So it's going to be tomorrow from 4 to 6 p.m. at Wetmore Hall at room 69. You can find the details on Facebook if you look at the meditation and motivation seminar on the Neuroscience Student Association page. So yeah, I hope to see you guys there. Thank you.
No, it's just an announcement.
Those were not.
All right, hi everyone, how's it going? Not so great, okay. All right, so we're almost there. We have 2 lectures left, and we have a lot of ground to cover over the next 2 lectures. So just to give you a little bit of context, these next 2 lectures, you're likely going to be tested on them for different concepts as well as application and being able to write about them as a short answer question. So in the next lecture, we're going to try to leave a little bit of time to go through what we're looking for on the short answer questions. For those of you who have submitted a draft and your surnames start with T through Z, I have actually posted comments back for you, and I've actually marked up the draft of your paper, so you can take a look at those. Some of them are already in really good shape. Some of them need a little bit more work. So please take a look if you can, and if it doesn't make any sense to you, let me know. I'm not having planned office hours this week, mainly because I heard there's some kind of poster thingy going on tomorrow, as well as on Friday. So good luck on your lab posters, and we'll have more set times next week. But I am happy to discuss any of the assignments with you. So today we're going to try to finish off some of the neurobiology that's associated with the exercise, and we'll go through some of the molecules that are involved in exercise, and then we're going to make a hard pivot and then go back to understanding things that, or try to understand things that we're not 100% sure of, but that we can still measure. So we can measure them and we can see them, but we're not really sure how these things actually happen. So just a correction from the last lecture, so I wanted to be clear on this. I was asked whether or not nu-N would be a marker for neurons, and I had been thinking in my head about double cortin for some reason, and so when I answered the question that nu-N, which is a marker that we've learned before, would not be a good marker and that it would be developmentally regulated as a neuronal marker, that was incorrect, and I wanted to make sure that you understood that I had made a mistake in lecture and that, in fact, it is a marker for neurons as well as MAP2, so that was sort of the discussion, and I wanted to go back and clarify that a little bit. So in the last lecture, we were sort of left with this really interesting phenomenon that we have a molecular mechanism that actually tells us that when muscles contract, muscles will start to produce and release more of this substance that comes from the parent molecule, which is known as FNDC5, that's on muscle, and will actually be released into the bloodstream. And as it gets into the bloodstream, this molecule, which was identified originally as irisin, can actually impact the brain in lots and lots of different ways. It impacts the brain in terms of increased BDNF production, and it would explain a lot of the phenomenon as to why exercise is beneficial to the brain. And again, that is a phenomenon that is well described. We know that it's true. There is no study out there that actually says that exercise is bad for the brain. And it turns out it doesn't matter how you exercise, any form of muscle contraction, whether it's resistance training, whether it's aerobic, anytime you contract muscle, it's good for your brain. Any exercise is good for your brain. But then there was this controversy around irisin, and we kind of left it at that irisin is this molecule that had been attacked in the literature. It had been called a myth rather than something that was real and released from muscle, and we call these muscle factors that get released myokines. And we're sort of stuck with this because there were two different groups of scientists, and actually it was not two different groups of scientists. It was one scientist, Bruce Spiegelman, and it was everyone else. Like, everyone was saying, no, this cannot possibly be a real effect. And again, Bruce Spiegelman came out very, very quickly within a span of just a few months to actually come back very strongly and to actually publish a paper that refuted the original scientific reports article saying it was all a myth. And in this paper here, they went through systematically, why is irisin not a real molecule? And we're going to revisit that. So why do scientists feel like this isn't real in the first place? And having read this, Bruce Spiegelman had to come up with a way to demonstrate that irisin actually existed, that it was not a myth, that it could indeed be found in the bloodstream. And in fact, it could be found in the bloodstream in a regulated fashion. So just showing that it's in the blood wouldn't do Bruce Spiegelman any favors because he has to show that exercise increases irisin. Does that make sense? Okay, so we're going to jump in. We're going to try to understand why this has so many of these different issues and why all of this began. So the first question I have is for you. If I'm going to detect a protein based on what you've learned in your third year labs or in your second year biology courses or throughout your academic career, how do I typically measure a protein? If I wanted to detect a protein, what do I use to detect a protein? So I use an antibody, or I would use Western blots using an antibody. Do you all agree antibodies are one of the ways in which we can detect protein levels? We have an antibody against the protein, and indirectly we can measure that protein. Does that make sense? And you've all sort of seen that. You probably have done it in your third year labs, and you probably have done Western blotting or immunostaining. So it makes sense. We have these specific antibodies. On top of that, though, what's important about that antibody? So it's got to be specific, and it can't interact or cross-react with anything else. If I have an antibody to irisin, it shouldn't interact with any other protein, right? Otherwise it's useless, it becomes nonspecific. And the issue is, the original papers that described irizin all involved antibodies. And when people started to use this antibody, they saw all sorts of nonspecific effects. And so, this is the conundrum. In the 21st century, do we still use antibodies? Of course we do, because it's fast and it's efficient. You can order them online and they get sent to you. But is it the best way and is it the only way? It is not the only way. And this is where Bruce Spiegelman had to convince everyone using a non-antibody mediated method to show that irizin exists. This is not trivial. Very few labs here at U of T do this because it is very time consuming and it takes a lot more time and effort than to go ahead and try to stain for the protein directly. So one of the ways in which he measured the protein directly, no antibody involved, just direct measurement of the protein, is by using what is known as tandem mass spectrometry. Okay, so here, there's no antibody involved. We use tandem mass spec to directly measure the appearance of a protein, and we can quantitate this by using mass spectroscopy. Okay, so this is the technique that he's going to use to convince you and the general audience about whether or not irizin actually exists. So again, going back in a very simple way, using these visual summaries or visual graphics or graphical abstracts, he's looking at sedentary behavior, so non-exercising versus exercising. He is going to measure irizin levels in the blood, either in sedentary individuals or in individuals after exercising, and he is going to use tandem mass spec to directly quantitate this protein. There's no antibody involved. You take the blood sample, and then you go and measure the level of the protein, and that by doing so, he is able to show that human irizin levels in humans will actually follow a time course or a peak that is dependent on the level of exercise. So this is what he is going to try to show you in this particular experiment. Does that make sense? Can I pause here for a second? Do any of you need to kind of reorient? Do you need any help with understanding anything? Quick question. Two different groups, correct. It is two different groups, but there's a sedentary measurement, and then there is at rest, and then there's after exercise. So there is that group. You can't just quantitate the exercise group by itself. Like again, remember irizin levels are also higher in exercising groups because we make more FNDC5. So we actually have to measure 2 different time points or 3 different time points in 2 different groups. Yeah.
I can't remember if you specified if we need to know if irizin acts on white or brown.
So irizin does interact with a number of different tissues, but it's used in the conversion of white to brown adipose tissue. Yes, Lauren. Yeah, well, they'll be taking a blood sample. So remember, it gets released into the circulation. From the circulation, it actually has to get up into the brain. That's the key point. Okay, so if we're ready to go, here's a list of things that people found fault with in terms of irizin. So when you look at irizin, and maybe it's surprising, maybe it's not, and we'll take a brief pause to just do a check-in. If you look at most proteins, if you do the sequence alignment and you do this in your lab, whether it's 3rd year, 4th year, or if you're in grad school, you do this routinely, whenever you look for that first methionine that you learned about in first year biology, you always see an ATG site. That tells you where your translation is going to start, right? Do you remember that from first year? Yes. So here, when you look at the sequence for irizin, it has what is known as a non-canonical start site. Its start site also produces methionine, but it is not an ATG, it's an ATA sequence. And so when people looked at that, they were like, this doesn't look like a real gene. They then go back, and then they take a look at the overall sequence, and they realize that it is a pseudogene. It doesn't have the normal characteristic features of a regular gene. It doesn't have the normal sort of start sites, nor does it have the normal sort of splicing sites, it doesn't look like a gene. It looks more like a pseudogene, part of a gene, or not a full gene. Is that surprising to you? So taking a step back, like, is this a valid criticism? You have to put your biology hats on, and you have to remember what irisin kind of resembles. Is this surprising to you? And for those of you who are in physiology, think back to what we talked about in the last lecture. Surprising, not surprising? Okay, surprising. Anyone else? It's a little surprising. Scientists were surprised. Yes. It's a cleaved product. Remember, it starts off as FNDC5, and then we take the N-terminal region, and that becomes irisin. So it kind of looks like a prohormone. And prohormones often have this. But again, there was a lot of scientific debate online as to whether or not irisin, the way that it was structured, and when they did a gene search and a gene blast, it kind of looked like a pseudogene, causing many, many people to doubt and to say that there was something going on with the results. When people used the antibody, and they did it on blood samples, and this is not Bruce Spiegelman's group, so this is after he came out with his 2013 article. In 2015, people had already started to use that antibody that he had published, and they tried to detect it. They couldn't see it. There were non-detectable levels of the protein. That's troubling, right? So using the same antibody that he had published with, there is like no detectable level of this protein. Is that good news for Bruce Spiegelman or bad news for Bruce Spiegelman? It's not great news, right? So again, there were lots of these issues with the antibody-based detection, which many, many individuals from Novartis, which is a drug company in Switzerland, as well as individuals at different research institutions across the United States, Europe, and Australia were reporting on. There were lots of issues with this antibody-based detection. They couldn't see it, or they got a completely different size band, and it didn't look very good for him. And it was not reproducible in everyone's hands, which was the worst. Science relies on the fact that what you publish, especially in a high-profile journal, has got to be reproducible. And if it's not reproducible in everyone's hands, we know that science already has a reproducibility issue, then it becomes more problematic. And this is a high-profile, multi-billion-dollar industry where people want to know if irisin is this molecule that Bruce Spiegelman is making it out to be. So he decides, I'm not going to detect this protein using an antibody. I'm going to detect the protein directly by using tandem mass spectroscopy, and this will measure in blood, and we'll be able to actually detect these proteins. Surprisingly, he got exactly the results that you would expect. So he actually showed that there was elevation following exercise, as you would expect, and in addition to that, if you are an individual who is already exercising, you have higher levels of irisin. So again, this is more of a technical note. So one of the things that he had done was to deglycosylate the samples. So a lot of times proteins have little sugar moieties or glycosyl groups put on them. They kind of interfere with mass spectroscopy, and so he deglycosylated his samples, although he showed the before-after of doing so. And then he also removed some of the proteins like IgGs and albumins. So going back to your physiology, why is that important? Why is removing IgGs and albumins important in this mass spec protocol? Can you think of a reason why? Going back to what you learned in first year or in physiology, anyone? Yep. Yeah. So absolutely, it is a carrier protein. Any other reasons why you might want to take out albumin as well as IgGs? So remember, you're trying to detect a protein, relatively small amounts if you're thinking about it. Yes. There's so much, right. They're usually found, these are some of the more abundant proteins, so you are removing the more abundant proteins. If you take a look at the profiles of all of the proteins in your blood, IgGs as well as albumins kind of dominate. So you take out all the major players, and then you are left with everything else. Okay, so we are trying to increase the sensitivity of this assay. So we remove all the ones, the common proteins like IgGs and albumins. deglycosylate to help us detect this more easily, and this is what he is doing in this particular scenario. So again, I already went through the sort of outline of this. And again, he is using tandem mass spec. So this is iRisin. He's looking for very, very specific peptide sequences that are unique, published, and they are indeed unique. If you do a blast search using the peptide sequences and you compare it against any other known gene, you will not find the same sequence. And so this is actually correct. And when you take a look, you'll actually see that the protein levels are in the nanogram per milliliter range. So is that good or bad? No idea. Okay, good. Fair answer. Fair answer. No idea is a good answer. I'm going to show you why this is good and why this is actually important. So you don't have to memorize these numbers, but just keep in mind we're looking at proteins on the order of nanograms per milliliter of blood sample. Okay? And it does indeed go up. So again, without going through this in a lot of detail, because the technical details, again, if you're doing a biochemistry lab or you're taking third-year biochem, would be important, but I don't want to kind of go through all of this. These are sort of the characteristic mass spec sequences or fingerprints that you would look for using the sequence that he had sort of indicated here. And again, the sequence is not so important, but he's able to use mass spec, and the size of the peak tells you about the abundance of the particular protein that you are looking for. And he is able to show across these different studies that generally speaking, we are able to see an increase in iRisin levels in individuals that exercise. And so we do see this increase that I showed you earlier. So why again is all of this important? So remember, one of the criticisms of his original work was that they simply could not detect the level of the protein. Do you remember that from one of the bullet points earlier? So we're all good to go? So here's the thing. When he does this experiment, and when he does this tandem mass spec, when he looks at the overall levels of the protein and he looks at the nanogram per milliliter levels, what is that comparable to? So, do you think in your bloodstream you have this hormone called insulin? Yeah? Pretty sure, pretty confident? Have you heard of this molecule known as TNF alpha? Do you think that TNF alpha is a myth? No. Okay, I'm glad. Good. All right. TNF alpha is also glad that it's not a myth. And then there are some other ones that are released from adipocytes, like adiponectin, adipsin, and others. But take a look. Right here in the middle, in this sort of yellow-brown box, we have iRisin. iRisin is not the least common of these proteins, and in fact, it's in the same range as other hormones that are associated with feeding behavior, like leptin. It's in the same range as insulin. And in addition to that, we also see that it's higher than the levels of glucagon. So what does this tell you? Does it tell you anything? If you were Bruce Spiegelman and you just saw this result, what would you say about this? Good. Okay, awesome. Yes, I would also say good. Anything else? Yes. Could it be broken down or further broken down? Possibly, possibly. Yes?
There might have been an error.
An error in detection from the other groups?
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so I like those responses, all great responses. Let's take a look at what Bruce Spiegelman actually said. So before I go on, just to be like completely transparent about this, because I hate seeing comments about this later, do you have to know everything from this slide? No, because you've already learned a lot. Do you guys get the cursor up there or no? Kind of. Okay. Why is it stopped right there in the middle? It's weird. Okay. So, do you need to know all of the things on this slide? No, but there is something that I do want you to know, that it is in the same physiological range as other hormones like leptin, resistin, insulin, glucagon, TNF alpha, interleukin 6. In fact, it's higher than some of those, right? Do you all see that? So it's in the range of some of these cytokines as well as other hormones. We should be able to detect this, right? Because we detect interleukin-6, we detect TNF-alpha, we detect insulin all the time. In fact, you have to be able to monitor insulin levels. And it's right there at the same level as things like insulin. Sorry, and either Michael or Jeffrey, do you have any idea why I can't get that cursor to go? Or is it just me? Okay, well, it kind of works sometimes, but it's not up there all the time. Yep. So the difference between 3.6 and 4.8 isn't enough to like drive it too far. If you look at the overall axes, it would actually not be that much different. Okay. Michael, I wouldn't worry too much about it. It's okay. Okay, well, we'll try to make do the best that we can. And now it's completely freezing up, which isn't any better. Sorry? Yeah, I think it's just telling me to kind of wait.
Might just be the laptop.
Could be.
It's going pretty crazy. Yeah, it might just be the laptop is freaking out a little bit.
All right. Okay, we'll just give it a second then. Do you know if I can actually go ahead to the next slide? No? All right, well, we're having these technical difficulties. Do any of you have any exams between like the 12th to the 19th? Because I'm thinking of holding like a review session during that time period. Is there a time or date that works better for most of you? The 15th is good or not good? Good. So we'll schedule something for like the afternoon of December the 15th. It'll be like a review session. If you can't make it, it's also fine because we'll do it online and we will record it as well. Is it good to go?
So the laser pointer is working.
Okay.
I think it's because of the HDMI connection.
Oh,
so
okay.
It just tracks really slowly. So if you
Okay.
move it somewhere and wait, it'll show up
Okay.
in that spot.
Awesome. Thank you. And all right. So again, this is just for your own information. This is in his paper. You can go back and read his paper. I left you the actual paper where it's from, like the full citation. So he goes through point by point. Like every criticism that we had, he goes through it point by point. And he goes through the fact that, there's no canonical ATG start sequence. So therefore, people started to believe that this thing is a myth and that N-irizin does not exist. And all of this is due to a poor artifact of very bad antibody specificity, all things that we've covered. So he's going in through this like point by point and dismantling all of the different arguments that these other authors have mentioned. And whenever you hear the word claimed or claim, it's not a good sign because basically you are calling the other scientists like into disrepute. So the other thing that is really good is that he uses really strong words. So you normally don't see things like definitively. That means like there's like no question. Like it's definitively there. So this assay definitively shows that human irisin circulates and has a very similar or identical architecture to the mouse protein. We see it at different levels that we would want. It confirms our earlier report, so it's going back like, we were right, you were wrong. Okay, so, and it's surprising that the other authors were not able to see this and they concluded that it was a myth. So when you want to read like a really salty paper, this is a paper you want to read and have in your back pocket. So again, when you have like the Bruce Spiegelman calling into question the methodology of the other authors, that also becomes a problem, right? So he's now saying, it's not my fault that you guys are bad scientists. It's your fault that you're bad scientists. And so these methodological deficiencies, where basically you're saying you're a bad scientist, is not something you normally see in publications, but this is like one of the great sort of bedtime reading stories. So if you have like nothing else to do, go through, check it out, and it's actually a great read. So that's sort of the end of the controversy, right? Agree? Sadly, it's not. So there's a couple of really odd things about this. So that paper, that rebuttal paper came out in 2015. And if this is a really hot area and a really hot topic, oh, good story, by the way, hot topic, go visit. So if you're thinking about this, you'd want to have more publications from Bruce Spiegelman's group on iRisin, but it's been like silence. So there haven't been a lot of things that have been published. And most of the other work that's been published about iRisin now comes from other groups, and they're not always great papers. So again, I'm not sure if you would want to publish in Progress in Neuropsychopharmacology and Biological Psychiatry. Again, not the greatest journal out there, but we're going to go through and take a look at a follow-up study that looks at iRisin, hopefully to integrate some of what we've looked at before. So hopefully some of this will make some sense when you're hearing about this when we go through it. So do you remember the tail suspension test, TST? Do you remember the forced swim test? Yes? So these are measures that we have, behavioral measures and outcomes that we can quantify in terms of depression. So for tail suspension tests, the longer they are immobile, the more likely they are going to be depressed. So if they're struggling, they're not immobile. And for forced swim tests, the longer they're sort of struggling, the better off they are. They're not as depressed. So here's this really interesting thing. So they wanted to know, because exercise has been implicated in producing beneficial effects to the brain, and it's been sort of looked at as an antidepressant in many, many papers. This paper isn't addressing this directly, but they're trying to get you to make this link subconsciously that here, if we equate exercise to iRisin, so that's Bruce Spiegelman, and if we directly give iRisin, which is normally the product of exercise, to mice that are depressed, can we make their depressive symptoms go away? Does that sort of make sense to you? Does that line of logic make sense to you? Kind of makes sense? Okay, so if we take a look at the depressed mice in black here, these are the controls. So they are depressed. They undergo chronic unpredictable stress protocols. And then we start into the intracerebral ventricles. We directly give iRisin through the ventricles, directly into the brain. Different levels of pure iRisin, like 0.1 nanograms, 0.5 nanograms, 1 nanogram, directly into the brain. Then should we see a change in depressive-like behaviors? Well, we do statistically at 0.5 nanograms as well as 1 nanogram, we see that they are actually less immobile. They are struggling more on this tail suspension test. Using this immobility time for the forced swim test, so the longer the animal is just floating, the worse off their depression is. If they're swimming more and they're less immobile, so they're still trying to swim, this forced swim test gives us an indication. And doing the same thing for iRisin, we see that the 0.5 is statistically significant, and the 1 nanogram delivery is also statistically significant. They function like they have less depressive symptoms. Does that make sense to everyone? Lots of Good? Not good? Is there anything I can clarify for you now or go back over for you? No. Are you good? Thumbs up? Not so good? So I think we have some thumbs up. All right, awesome. All right, so a couple of other things. So they also wanted to know, if I give iRisin to these animals, do I not only work on symptoms of depression, but does it also help with things like anxiety? And so by taking a look at iRisin delivery and by using standard tests of anxiety-like behavior, can we assess whether or not iRisin has any effect on anxiety-like behavior? So a mouse that's depressed or depressed and is being treated with iRisin is put into this chamber. There's a camera that actually tracks its movements. And most of the time, if an animal is feeling stressed or is feeling anxiety because of the stress, it undergoes a type of behavior which is known as thigmotaxis. And thigmotaxis is where the animal is right up against the wall. So it likes to hug the wall or most of the time it's moving where it is always in connection with the wall because it knows a predator can't attack it from this side and it feels safer there. If the animal is feeling less anxiety and it's not as stressed out, then it will actually go out into the open, right? So you've all sort of seen squirrels and you've sort of seen how they like to hang out near trees when they're stressed out because they can run up it. And if they're feeling pretty adventurous, then they'll kind of cut across into the open. It's the same type of behavior that we're measuring. And this thigmotaxis is where it likes to be up against the barrier. So it likes to run along the side of a wall. So there's no difference really in terms of the number of crossings. So the animal is moving normally. It's a measure of locomotion. And if we look at the number of times these animals, whether they're depressed or not, whether they're treated with irizin or not, their type of locomotory activity is also just like standing up on its hind feet or just exploring the side of the cage on its hind feet is roughly the same. There's no statistical difference between these different groups. But if we start to see measures of anxiety, how much time does the animal actually spend in the center of the box? If it's depressed, very little time in the center. At very low doses, depression plus low doses of irizin, very little time. But again, using the same doses of 0.5 and 1, we see that they're spending much more time in the middle of the box, saying that they're less anxious. Again, if you're anxious and in an animal, you have like grooming behavior. The more anxious you are, the more often you're grooming yourself. And we see the same sort of reduction in grooming behavior, saying that they're less anxious. Even though they're depressed, they have this fewer grooming-like behaviors. Again, the number of fecal pellets that get produced, if you're really scared, nervous, we shouldn't be talking about fecal matter at this time in the university. Sorry about that. I put this out there before like all the current events of around the campus, but generally speaking, the more nervous you are, the more fecal pellets you produce. And if you're feeling more relaxed, there's less of that production. Okay, so everything here indicates that irizin, direct application of irizin through the intracerebral ventricles can actually ameliorate some of the things that we looked at earlier, like depression as well as anxiety. Do you have any questions on this before we go on? Or anything that I need to clarify for you? Yes? Yep. Yep, they could have. They could have looked for other measures like cortisol levels. Here they're just looking at a behavioral output. Any other questions? Yes? Sorry, what is A? That's just normal locomotory activity. So if irizin is actually increasing its locomotory speed or the amount of movement that it generates, then it wouldn't be a fair assessment. So if it's causing you to be more energetic, for example, it wouldn't be a fair assessment. Yes? So were these results permanent or did they go away? So the way that you deliver this, it would be sort of on a continual basis. So it's a good question. I'm not really sure. Any other questions that I can answer for you now? No. Okay. All right, so we're going to get into sort of the last section. So we have sort of made this slow progression, and they are kind of all related, so just bear with me for a second. So we started off by looking at a model system, and we looked at depression as a model system. And then we started to look at different things that might affect depression. So one of the things that we know can impact depression might be things like diet. So we took this little detour. We talked about omega-3 fatty acids, we talked about diet, we talked about other things. It was inconclusive, and in fact, the literature is still very inconclusive. Does diet help you after depression? And then we looked at another thing. Does exercise help? And yes, it does. Exercise 100% helps with different forms of depression. Not universally, but for the most part, depression seems to respond well to certain forms of exercise, and that's consistent in the literature. But the unicorn that we encountered there was really this irizin. Is this the messenger system that causes the brain to get better through exercise. And what we're going to do now is kind of look at the other aspects. So can we understand things like how the brain responds to different types of stimuli? And again, you might hear more about this if you go to the NOS seminar, a little bit about mindfulness. Can we get mice to be mindful? And can we get mice to believe something? Can you get a mouse to believe something? Conditioning. Okay, so conditioning. We'll get back to that in a second. So you believe that mice can believe? Yeah, okay, wow. All right, awesome. Okay, we'll see if that holds true. So before we get there, I want to just indicate like how powerful the mind is and why the mind is actually not something that we should take for granted. And actually, I see less and less of these, or maybe I'm looking in the wrong place. Do any of you know who this individual here is? Steve Jobs, right. So I see that some of you are fans of his products and are willing to shell out thousands of dollars. Good for you. Steve Jobs, smart guy? Very smart guy, I'd agree. Very smart individual. So a really smart individual, how do you get a really smart individual, since we're talking about belief, to believe something that isn't true? So really smart individual, maybe like you. Maybe some of you take, how many of you take vitamin supplements? Vitamin supplements are good for you, generally speaking, but there's no scientific evidence that's consistent that says that all vitamins are good. There's controversies about vitamin D and many, many others. So we're going to talk a little bit about Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs is a really smart individual. He passed away a number of years ago. And here's why it bothers me, because he is really smart. He's like smart. Like you guys are really smart. And so the thing about smart people is they kind of make up their minds about what they want to believe or not believe. And so Steve Jobs had kind of grown up in California. If you have the opportunity, please go to California. Very different environment than it is here. I spent a couple of years as a postdoc down at Stanford. Wonderful environment, but very, very different culture than we have up here in Toronto. And one of the things that makes it really kind of unique is that they have their own sort of way of looking at things. And they're very health conscious, very health oriented. They like being outside, all great things because of the weather. But if you were to look at Steve Jobs' life, most of his life he was a vegetarian or a vegan. And most of his life he was actually very conscious about living a healthy lifestyle and making sure that he ingested lots of antioxidants, and he had read a lot of literature that was published about the effects of antioxidants and about how holistic and natural healing were sort of better alternatives than traditional medicine. Keep all of this in mind as we hear a little bit more about Steve Jobs. So Steve Jobs is, again, one of these individuals, really brilliant, starts off his career. At the peak of his career, as many of you will know, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, right? Do you know what pancreatic cancer is? Yep. So we're going to get to pancreatic cancer in a little bit more detail. But here's the remarkable story for Steve Jobs. Like, again, remarkable story if you think about this. So Steve Jobs has pain in his abdomen, and he happens to have, like, all the cards are falling into place for him. So one, he happens to live in Palo Alto, and Palo Alto has one of the best medical centers, the Stanford University Medical Center. He is taken in because one, he's Steve Jobs, two, he's like really rich, and three, he's like in the area. So he gets in, and he happens to see like a leading sort of cancer biologist who's a researcher and a physician. So all of the cards are kind of falling into place. He immediately has an ultrasound done because that's not the normal way that you get diagnosed, but his oncologist and the person who's responsible for him, being a relatively young physician who's also involved in research, suspects that there's something going on with Steve Jobs. So he gets an ultrasound, which is not the typical procedure, and his ultrasound shows that he has a small mass growing on his pancreas. And they decide to do a biopsy. So again, he's in the right place, he has all this money, he can afford to get this operation, and he's getting an early diagnosis. In fact, if you read Walter Isaacson's book, the biography of Steve Jobs, the physician that's on call is actually like saying, wow, you are so lucky, you are blessed to be able to get this detected early, and it happens to be a form of pancreatic cancer that is non-malignant, so it's benign, right? Again, everything is falling into place. So you're Steve Jobs, the richest man in the world at the time, at a university center, one of only 2 at the time that can actually do the types of surgeries to remove this tumor without causing a lot of discomfort, and you happen to be there. So what do you decide to do? Get the surgery, but not Steve Jobs. So Steve Jobs decides, even though all the cards are falling into place for him, he decides that, no, you know what, I am going to go and talk to my nutritionist. My nutritionist and I will decide on how best to use antioxidants in my diet to shrink this tumor, and we'll do it holistically. But thank you for finding this now before it got bigger. And of course, it didn't work. This benign tumor quickly reverted to a malignant tumor. He had to have his pancreas removed, and in fact, it had spread to his liver, so many of you will have heard that he had to get a liver transplant, all because he decided to wait. The smartest man in the world, the richest man in the world, all the cards falling into place for him, decides that based on all these things, that he's going to wait. Because the power of the mind says, for him, that natural is better than surgical options, right? And this is why I'm angry, because some of you may also have that. You will also fall into this trap that even though we have tried to get you to think along the lines of evidence-based medicine, that you might think that one form of like just eating better might help you in terms of cancer. If an opportunity presents itself where you can get appropriate treatment in a timely fashion, please go ahead and do so. Don't wait, because that would make me angry too, for you. So this is why it's an angry lecture. So let's look a little bit at the biology of this, and I'm going to take you through some different aspects of the brain and belief systems, and we're going to end sort of with these different belief systems. So pancreatic cancer, unfortunately, is actually a big deal now. So as our population gets older, the number one predominant risk factor for pancreatic cancer is actually age. The older you get, the more likely you are to develop pancreatic cancer. It's going to happen as long as you get older. And it is a silent killer. For the most part, you don't even know that it's happening. So again, think about Steve Jobs. He had abdominal pain, unusual. He goes in, gets it ultrasound image, then he's able to show like this mass growing on his pancreas. So it's very asymptomatic. You won't even know that you have it, especially as you get older. It will just sort of be lurking there in the background, and it's very asymptomatic. Once it starts to become bad, and once it can be detected, then you are already too late. You will have this really dramatic loss in weight. So my grandfather passed away from like pancreatic cancer, and we happened to see like the really severe loss in his physical functioning as the pancreatic cancer got worse and worse and worse. And this, even after getting surgery to have the pancreas removed, it was like really, really bad. So there's a lot of weight loss. Usually in the later stages, there's a lot of pain in the upper abdominal region because the pancreas is nearby the liver ducts, the hepatic ducts. It'll often result in jaundice, which is a yellow discoloration of the skin. And it's also associated with Trousseau sign. So Trousseau sign is where you have hypercoagulation of your blood. Your blood clots much more quickly and more often if you have Trousseau sign, and this is often seen in pancreatic cancer along with clogging of the gastric outlet caused by this increased coagulation. Steatorrhea, for those of you, I don't know why we're on this theme today, steatorrhea. What was that sigh? A form of diarrhea, opposite of diarrhea, I guess, kind of. Not constipation, so that's the extreme opposite. Slow bowel movement. Okay, how about I just tell you? Fatty poo, right? I don't know why we're into poo today. Sorry, it's just one of those things. Steatorrhea is where you get too much fat, and so when your poo floats, it's steatorrhea. And this is related to that jaundice. And again, Age is one of the more predisposing factors, much more common as you reach the ages of 60, 70. Our population is getting older, and many of us are worried primarily about neurodegenerative conditions, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's disease. We keep talking about that, but in fact, pancreatic cancer is probably going to be more likely to affect your family than Alzheimer's disease is, to be quite honest, and especially as our population gets older. If you are a smoker, you're much more likely to develop pancreatic cancer. If you have a high-fat diet and you have had a high-fat diet for a very long period of time, or a diet that contains like high protein for very long periods of time, that is also a predisposing factor of you developing pancreatic cancer earlier and the more severe forms of pancreatic cancer. If you have an infection in your stomach of a bacterium known as Helicobacter pylori, how many of you know that you have an infection of your stomach of Helicobacter pylori? Some of you? Okay. So again, it's asymptomatic. A third of you will actually be infected with Helicobacter. Even if you're healthy, you'll have Helicobacter, and a third of you will have it. You'll have no signs of it, so you won't know, and it's an infection of the stomach by this bacteria. And if you have autosomal dominant mutations in BRCA2 and PALB, which stands for the partner and localizer of BRCA2, some forms of pancreatic cancer have this because these are the different proteins that are involved in repairing double-stranded DNA breaks. And if you have mutations in either PALB or in BRCA2, your DNA can't repair itself. And this happens much more frequently within some of the pancreatic cells in the pancreas. So I think it's 5 o'clock, so let's take a break now. We'll come back and then we'll continue on with different aspects of belief systems and everything else. Music during the break. Nope. Sure, I guess. Do you want to figure out how to best do that, or talk to one of those individuals? They might be able to help set that up.
I was thinking Fly Me to the Moon by Frank Sinatra.
We don't actually have to, we can just do it directly. You've done. Oh, that's right. Will the audio work? It should. Speakers? Don't put it up that high. Sorry.
Maybe because it's going through the HDMI and the sound is going. Did you hear something?
Tried here, but I think last time we tried it on this. I think
it's probably just
yeah, I think we need a cord.
Saturday's not going to work. So just move it.
We could always not move this. Just put it up to the speaker.
you don't mind, I think we're just going to get going. So again, just to go through things really briefly in terms of the pancreatic cancer and the different classifications of the different forms of pancreatic cancer. So again, think about the luck that Steve Jobs had. He was not diagnosed with the most common form of pancreatic cancer. He was actually diagnosed with what is known as a neuroendocrine islet pancreatic cancer. So it's a benign form. It can continue to grow and it can become malignant, but this was the early detection, early benign form of it, and he decided to wait, like the worst possible outcome that you could look for. Most people, because by the time that they see the signs and symptoms, or because their hospitals are not really well equipped to detect pancreatic cancer, the vast majority of pancreatic cancers, 90% of them, are the malignant form. And these are usually adenocarcinomas, which are either formed at the level of the pancreatic duct or at the level of the cyst cells. And the pancreatic cancer normally arises not from the endocrine cells, which is the more benign form, but from the exocrine cells, so the ones that you hear about that are involved in digestion, in physiology, so the proteases, all of the different enzymes that are involved in digestion of food. The exocrine cells are the ones that mutate, become malignant, and then form this full-blown pancreatic cancer. And again, you don't need to worry about the overall diagram here on the right. It's just to orient you a little bit or to give you a little bit of a review of the pancreas. Most forms of cancer in 2019 actually have a pretty good prognosis. You can have a diagnosis of certain forms of leukemia, for example, have a really good prognosis. Pancreatic cancer is one of those forms of cancer that it's not a good prognosis, even in 2019. We normally talk about a 1-year survival rate and a 5-year survival rate. For some forms of cancer, the 5-year survival rate could be like 95%, which means that out of 100 people that are diagnosed with cancer today, 95 of them will still be alive 5 years from now if they receive treatment. And pancreatic cancer has a very low 10 to 15% survival rate. So most people who are diagnosed, they don't make it to the 5-year point. So it's a very, very serious form of cancer. And again, Steve Jobs had everything going for him with the neuroendocrine benign form, but he decided that I'm not going to go ahead and do it. I'm going to rely on my own belief systems. There are, by the way, if you have pancreatic cancer and it is diagnosed at a stage where they feel that it can be operated on, there are different surgical options where you can have the pancreas completely removed. Unfortunately, because of its location and because of the nature of the cells and the nature of the different ducts and the nature of the type of cancer, the tumor that develops, this tends to spread. So you don't just remove the pancreas. In fact, you end up removing parts of the stomach, parts of the duodenum, and the jejunum, etc. And then you have to kind of repair and stitch everything back together to cause a normal functioning GI tract. And again, that's for your own information. And so we don't have very good outcomes right now for pancreatic cancer. Even if you get the Whipple procedure, which is the removal of all of these different organs shown to you here in red, and you reattach them, it's really not a good outcome, because think of what the pancreas does, not just in terms of insulin release, but it's also releasing proteases, it's releasing amylases, it's releasing a whole bunch of different lipases, and so it's really hard to digest food if your pancreas isn't there. So your quality of life is really affected. And in terms of the neurobiology, it's really painful because it can actually affect a number of nearby ganglia that are in the area of the pancreas. And the celiac ganglia especially tends to send pain signals back into the brain. And so usually they have to have a ganglion block. You have to prevent the pain message from being introduced into the spinal cord and from ascending into the brain. And so usually that nerve is destroyed either through radiation or through chemotherapy. So it's not a great outcome. It's not a great type of cancer to have. No cancer is a good cancer to have, but the key message is everything was kind of going in Steve Jobs' favor. The fact that he's rich, the fact that he's in the right location, the fact that he has a really brilliant young doctor, the fact that he gets diagnosed early, the fact that he has a neuroendocrine form of it, everything is going his way except his belief system. His belief system is wrong, that just by eating nutritious carrot juice and by living on a diet of carrot juice, which is antioxidants, the antioxidants will prevent the cancer from spreading. And in fact, it did not work. And so with that in mind, we're going to transition into belief systems, the human belief system first and the biology of the human belief system, and then we'll move into the animal belief system if it actually does exist, which the table up here at the front is adamant that there is a belief system in animals. We'll see in a moment. Okay, so how many of you think the placebo effect is real? Okay, great. So that's the vast majority of you. So why do you believe the placebo effect is real? Yes? Okay, so yeah, our minds and our brains especially, so more about the cognitive part, our brains are in fact very good pattern discriminators, so we're looking for edges, we're looking for things in our visual field, we're always looking for patterns, that's true. Anything else? Like, why do you believe the placebo effect is true? Any ideas? You just believe that it's true, yes? Okay, so do you have to believe that the placebo effect is going to work for it to work? That's the key question I'm asking. No? So regardless, the placebo effect will work. Or do you have to believe that it's going to work? Okay, we're gonna explore that, okay? So hold on to that thought. I know it's a little bit out there, but I need you to think a little bit about this. You don't need to worry about the next few slides. I'll tell you when you can pick up the rest of the story in a moment. The placebo effect has actually been around since about the 17th century. As far as we can tell, people have maybe made use of it earlier, but in the 18th century, there was actually so much work that was being done. And in particular, there was an individual who was in Europe who was going around to different sort of European countries, and he was very, very forceful. He was a very, very forceful individual with a tremendous personality, and this is Franz Anton Mesmer. So if you heard of mesmerism or being mesmerized, it comes from his name. And what he showed was he had found, or he was suggesting that he had found a new force of nature, and this force of nature was animal magnetism, and that by imbuing different inanimate objects with this new force of nature, by touching it, in other words, and by touching it for longer periods of time, he could put animal magnetism, this new force of nature, into this piece of wood. And under the right circumstances, if I had touched this and I had imbued it with this animal magnetism, it could induce other people to start crying or swooning or having emotional responses. And he was able to show this throughout most of the different countries within Europe, and this caused a lot of controversy in the scientific community. Much like the controversies that we're looking at, in the old days, they also started to investigate these controversies. Like we've looked at iRisin and the controversies there, the controversies around food and omega-3 fatty acids. And so what Louis XIV, the king of France, decided to do was he wanted to create a royal commission, which is not very much different than what would be done now in Canada. If, for example, someone said that there's a brand new cure that helps individuals with multiple sclerosis, a commission would be set up within Health Canada. They would investigate it, and they would call in leading experts. And the King of France did exactly the same thing. And he assembled, at the time in the 18th century, this all-star group of scientists from around the world. So he called over Benjamin Franklin from America, Antoine Lavoisier, who was the leading scientist in France at the time, and they wanted to know if we apply the scientific method to what Franz Anton Mesmer is doing, can we actually show that there is this new force of nature? And this is what the title of this particular section is. So one of the things that Anton Mesmer was particularly good at was being a showman. So one of the things that he did was he would go into a forest and he would like touch, like imbue a tree, this tree here, with his animal magnetism. And by doing that and allowing women to come up and like hug the tree, he would pass that animal magnetism into the women, and these women would be like swooning and fainting and like crying and having all sorts of emotional responses. Do you believe that to be something that's possible? Possible? Possible. Okay, it happened. It was real. So here are these really interesting scientists, Benjamin Franklin, Antoine Lavoisier, so sort of the all-stars of like science at the time. They're coming in and they want to prove or disprove that this is actually happening. So you're a modern scientist. How would you do this experiment? You want to show that this happens or doesn't happen. What would you do? You're a modern scientist, 21st century scientist. Come on, you have like 3 centuries on these individuals. Yes? Okay, separate out a positive group, negative group. Okay, any other ideas? Not a bad idea, Cindy. Any other ideas? Yes. Randomized control trials. And in fact, they ran the very first randomized control trials. How do you run a randomized control trials on trees? Yes. Any ideas? Yes. Randomize the trees. Yes, that's right. Awesome. Hey, this table doing awesome. So what they decided to do was they would actually get someone who was an animal magnetism specialist and touch certain trees randomly, and they would also have trees that were not imbued with animal magnetism, and then they would tell their volunteers, come into the forest. That's a really creepy invitation, by the way. Come into the forest and hug this tree. So this is where like tree hugging comes into play, and they didn't tell the individuals which one of the trees was actually imbued or not imbued, right? So that's that randomized control, the positive negative effect. And so they weren't told, but what do you think happened to those individuals? So some were told that this tree is imbued, this tree is not imbued. Like, what do you think happened? So if they were told that the tree was imbued with animal magnetism, it had been touched by one of the disciples of Anton Mesmer, they had the response, even though they were told after that, nope, wrong tree, it's that one over there, you picked the wrong one, they still had this response. But here's the interesting thing. Antoine Lavoisier and Benjamin Franklin actually said, these are real effects. So as long as you believe that you are touching this tree, you are going to have an emotional response, and that emotional response is actually real. Does that make sense? Of course it makes sense, because it's this belief system that you have in your head. And in fact, many, many years later, in 1955, after the Korean War, so during the Korean War, there were lots of sort of anecdotal stories about individuals who were in pain. There wasn't enough morphine around to go and treat the pain. So individuals weren't told that they were given morphine, but they were given sort of saline, and they were told, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going to give you morphine. I can't give you much more, but this will help you with your pain. They believed that they were getting morphine, and so their pain levels went down. This was reported during the Korean War, and in 1955, the very first sort of clinical trial that was done after the Korean War, one of the Korean War veterans, Dr. Henry Beecher, actually conducted a clinical drug trial using different forms of morphine. This was the first double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. So the doctors didn't know what they were giving, the patients didn't know what they were giving, and it was sort of a double blind. There was a placebo, there was an inert substance that was given. And he was able to show, Henry Beecher was able to show, that in fact this was a real effect too. So by believing that you're getting morphine, your pain levels actually did go down. So the doctor didn't know if you were getting morphine or not. He might be just giving saline, but he believed he was giving morphine. The patient believed he was giving morphine, and that was enough to get the pain levels to go down. And in fact, he was able to publish a research article that you can go and look up called The Powerful Placebo, and it is still available and it is still cited this day. Would you be surprised to learn that if you continue on along these lines, that when you look at the placebo effect, you're giving an inert substance. There's like no drug. It's just like sugared powder, or it's like just saline. There's no active drug. That in fact, these placebo effects where the patients have a disease or a disorder or pain or something going on, if they're given an inert substance, as long as they believe they're getting an active compound, that it works on psychiatric disorders. So if you tell someone with depression that they're getting an antidepressant med, they actually will feel less depressed. It works on analgesia, pain control, and that's been shown consistently. Parkinson's disease. So if you're told that you're getting L-DOPA, but in fact you're not getting L-DOPA, why do Parkinson's patients actually get better? Their movement gets better. They have less sort of movement disorders. So in 1998, Kirsch and Saperstein actually started to examine where all of these sort of played in. They started to develop a theory and a model for how all of this worked, and it kind of they have kind of come up with a really interesting set of data related to the placebo that we're going to go through next. Here's the surprising thing, and this was on the very first slide of the lecture. The placebo effect in 2019 is higher than it was in 2009. And that was higher than it was 10 years before. In the general population, the placebo effect is actually increasing, right? So more and more individuals have a placebo effect. They believe that an inert drug is actually beneficial to them. Can you think of a reason why this might be occurring? So it's well reported, well documented. It is increasing. It's actually causing drug companies lots and lots of problems because you can't control for the placebo effect anymore. It keeps going up. That means that when you compare against the placebo, your drug that you're hoping to show is working for depression compared to placebo, which works just as well, that is messing up your data. So can you think of a reason why the placebo effect is going up in the general population? Yes. Do you think more people read more science articles? No. Okay. Lauren, do you have an idea? Okay, possible. So the short answer is no one knows. We'll leave it up to your generation to figure that out. It is a well-described phenomenon, though, and this gets into a statistical analysis called Hedges G, and it's been shown that over the last decade and 2 decades, the overall population, there are more people that actually respond to the placebo effect, and we don't know why, and it is messing up a lot of different studies. So there are a lot of different things that probably play into the placebo effect. There's always a belief system, a psychosocial element. You have to believe that you're getting something in order for it to work. And some of these psychosocial factors that provide context. So if you, yes? It seems to be worldwide. Most of the studies that are done using placebo and double-blind randomized control studies are done in North America and Europe. The few studies that have reported from like East Asia as well as South Asia also seem to show that their levels compared to 10 years ago seem to be higher too. So I don't know if that answers your question, Francisca, but I think it's a general trend. And I don't know. Like you can figure that out. You can win your Nobel Prize, invite me to Sweden later. How's that? Okay, so going back along the lines of different factors. So if you go in and you get a drug at the hospital from someone who looks like their medical doctor, are you going to benefit more from that drug than if your best friend gave it to you? Like, yes, probably. Even though they're your best friend, right? Still, right, okay. And you'll still remain best friends after. But there is that psychosocial context that allows for drugs to work better under certain circumstances versus others. And part of this is expectancy. So there's this patient perceiving a benefit. There's behavioral conditioning, to go back to your colleague's earlier point. And then there's always this social interaction. So sometimes just interacting with someone makes the situation better. So here's the thing. We know that there's a psychosocial context, okay? So this works best when we're describing it for pain, and this is sort of a standard test that is used, and this is how we test for expectation. Expectation is one of the factors that mediates the placebo effect, and so do we get the same overall placebo effect regardless of what is being given? So if we look here on this axis, we are seeing a relative pain score. So if you've gone into the hospital and then you're given sort of a line and they're asking you to indicate on this line, like how much pain are you feeling right now? This is what is known as a visual analog scale or a VAS score. So on the y-axis, we're looking at the visual analog scale. So 0 being like I feel no pain, 10, worst pain I've ever felt in my entire life. And so if you are being treated and you're coming out of surgery, if you're getting different anti-analgesics, so things that will lower your pain, things like morphine or tramadol or non-opioid substances like ketorolac, you can be administered this, the same dose, by the way, exactly the same dose, in two different ways. You can be given this by a physician, so you're being given the drug by a physician who is telling you like, oh, how much pain are you feeling? Okay, let me give you an injection of morphine. But you're actually getting morphine, okay? So let me make that clear. Is that clear for everyone? And so you are told, okay, so how much pain are you in? Oh, I have like the worst possible pain. I'm on like an 8 right now. I'm like having pain of 8. And then the physician who I'm seeing right in front of me gives me an injection of morphine or any of these other compounds out in the open. And then he asks me about an hour later, how are you feeling now? I think I'm better. I think I'm at a 6. So we would say, oh, you've gone down. You feel less pain, and you're feeling like 2 points less of that pain. Are we good so far? Good? If you do that same experiment, where you, instead of being administered that amount of morphine by a machine, a patient-controlled device or a machine that is automatically infusing you with the same amount of morphine that you would get from the doctor, this is known as a closed or hidden system, and you're given the exact same thing, well, look at the difference. You actually feel that you're still in pain. So the expectation is that the doctor is going to be providing you with more help. Even though you're getting exactly the same amount of drug, and you're getting the same drug, you have less of a benefit. There is less of an effect from receiving this in a closed or hidden fashion than it is from an open fashion. So we know that these psychosocial factors actually work. They are part of that placebo effect. This is not showing you placebo directly, but it's showing you one of the factors that makes up the placebo effect. And this is expectation. And we can measure expectation by either giving an open or a hidden delivery of a drug that should benefit you. So, just talked about a lot of things. Do you have any questions about this or anything that I can clarify for you now or anything that you just want to confirm? Yep? Not in this study. This is just to look for expectancy. Yes? So in this case, it's purely hidden. So the patient doesn't know when the drug is being given. It's just after surgery. They get the same amount. Bolus injection. It's not a patient-controlled device. Any other questions? Yes? Yeah, it definitely is a part of the placebo. That's correct. Right, so here, there is no placebo. They're actually being given the drug. This difference in the two scores actually indicates that this extra benefit is part of the placebo effect, or might be contributed to the placebo effect.
So
Yep.
does that mean that if you did the hidden assay with the placebo versus the actual drug, you'd see a similar difference?
You might see a very similar result. That's correct. Yes, do you have a question? The social interaction is part of the psychosocial factors and the expectancy that having a doctor actually giving you the drug is going to make you better. That's correct. All right. So this is just to illustrate the visual analog scores. So if you go back and you think a little bit about how this might all kind of occur, there are two different systems that are probably going to be involved in the placebo effect. And this is also experimentally sort of well documented. We know a lot about these different pathways. And so let me tell you about the one in purple on the right-hand side of your diagram first, and then I'll come back and talk about the VTA nucleus accumbens and the dopaminergic pathway just in passing. So if we're looking at the pain pathway being sort of that opioidergic pathway, so all the opioids and the non-opiates, they're used to control pain. They're used to block this pain pathway that is shown here. Does the placebo work in any of these different pathways? Well, it has to. And so if we begin with this belief system that we are getting a benefit, that something psychosocial, we're seeing a doctor, we're sort of getting this interaction, all of that is being processed at the very beginning in this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And we can actually go in and start activating this opioidergic pathway. So we can manipulate this descending pathway in how we normally feel pain. So we start by processing pain in the cerebral cortex as part of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that can then signal to the periaqueductal gray, or the PAG, which then sends signals down to the rostral medulla and then down into the spinal cord. If we block this signal at any of these levels, this is that opioidergic pathway, we can actually inhibit the sensation of pain. And it's believed that the placebo effect is actually manipulating and inhibiting different parts of this descending pain pathway. That's why it's so effective, especially in analgesia and pain. So we know that this is likely the pathway because if we do all the experiments that I just indicated to you, all of the placebo effects that are driven by this analgesic pathway, this descending pathway that I've outlined for you here, we can block this by blocking with an opioid receptor antagonist. So if I give you naloxone and I try to induce a placebo effect in you, so you might have had the placebo effect, like you go in, you're feeling that the placebo effect is working, or the placebo is working, you feel less pain. And if I decided to also inject in naloxone or naltrexone, your descending pathway is going to be affected, and so the placebo effect is also going to be affected. So you block the placebo effect by giving naloxone or naltrexone, which are opioid receptor antagonists. We can also directly activate cholecystokinin releasing neurons. If I activate those, I will also block the placebo pathway as well. So we know that this descending pathway is how the placebo works. We can block this descending opioid pathway by giving naloxone or naltrexone, or we can activate CCK-containing neurons, which will also inhibit this opioid pathway that is used by the placebo effect. And so this is sort of the circuit that Kirsch and Saperstein had worked out. And it's a pretty good circuit in terms of being able to isolate different things that can manipulate it. I won't spend too much time on the effects of dopamine, but this is sort of another pathway and why it works also in Parkinson's disease. You get the release or the excess release of dopamine in certain conditions as well. So I'm going to just go through really quickly, and apologies on this. The next few slides are important, and if you are not great at memorization, and I'm not going to try to do this on purpose, but it will be something that you see on your final exam, particularly for multiple choice, as well as for short answer. Some of these single nucleotide polymorphisms are important, and you need to understand these, and so circle the next 2 pages because there's a lot of these single nucleotide polymorphisms. So just like we talked about BDNF having different isoforms, are some people better at falling for like placebos than others? It turns out yes. There's a genetic factor that is involved in this. So there are biomarkers or biosignatures for individuals that are better placebo responders. So they're the ones that drug companies want to identify and exclude from drug studies because they may mess up the clinical trials that are going on. The ones that are particularly important are ones that we haven't discussed. So we talked about this descending opioid pathway, but it turns out that genetic variations of serotonin are the ones that actually make you a better placebo responder or not. So one of these enzymes is known as tryptophan hydroxylase 2, or TPH2, and within the gene promoter region, there are 2 different variations at position 703. There is a G variant and there is a T variant. If you have 2 variants, so 2 copies, and you're homozygous in the promoter region for G, so you're GG at position 703, you are a stronger placebo responder. So you are more likely to respond to placebos. You're going to hug trees more often. You're going to think the drug is working better for you if you have this single nucleotide polymorphism. If you have the T variant, you're not a good placebo responder, and drug companies pay a lot of money to enroll you within their studies because you're not going to have the placebo effect. This is also true for the long variant of the 5-HTP-LLR. Do you remember that one by any chance? The transporter? Do you remember anything about the long versus the short version, the L versus the S? So where is this sort of occurring? Where is the truncation occurring? So it's in that VNTR region, so it's not going to affect the protein, but we already saw this. If you have the long variant, you are also going to be a better responder for placebos. The short variant, you are less likely to be a placebo responder. Any questions on this before we go on? Or anything I can clarify for you, confirm for you now before we go on? Important slides, so I'm not going to lie, you're going to get questions, multiple choice. You need to be able to identify what makes you a better placebo responder or what variations make you a better placebo responder. Okay, so you'll 100% guaranteed, expect it as a multiple choice, final exam, this slide. Any questions? Confirmation? Nothing. Okay. So there's some more genetic markers as well. So one of the enzymes that breaks down neurotransmitters is known as monoamine oxidase. One of those isoforms of monoamine oxidase is MAOA. MAOA also has GT polymorphisms as well. And if you have higher levels of MAOA, the enzyme that breaks down neurotransmitters, you have lower placebo responses. Higher activity, break down neurotransmitters, you're not going to respond as easily to placebos. And normally, this means that you have 2 versions of the GG within the MAO. Another one of these is the COMT polymorphism. So again, valine methionine at position 158. So if you have a mutation or single nucleotide polymorphism that produces lower activity of COMT, and this is caused by the MM alleles, having 2 of those alleles, you also will have a higher placebo response. We're not really sure if these play a role in depression, social anxiety. There's some individuals that suggest that these genetic markers that are there for placebo are also markers for potentially other conditions like social anxiety, as well as major depression. Still not clear on that yet. There's a lot of data that says yes, some data says no, and some data is completely neutral. on that. So just letting you know that it's still an area of controversy. So in terms of this particular diagram here, need to memorize it? Don't need to memorize it. How many of you say yes, memorize, memorize, memorize? Or as we learned today, mesmerize, mesmerize, mesmerize. Any ideas, guesses? No need. Ooh. Understand. Understand or memorize. So I'm going to point out what I'd like you to make sure that you are aware of. I'm not sure how much of if some of you are taking Psych 396, then you might have had this already. But when we get the amino acid tryptophan entering into a neuron, this tryptophan is converted by that TPH2, that enzyme that we looked at earlier, into 5-HTP. This is then converted through a decarboxylase, an aromatic amino decarboxylase, into the neurotransmitter 5-HT. And here's sort of the breakdown product. So just this portion up here, the synthetic pathway for the serotonin. If you've had it in other lectures, I'm hoping it's a review for you. You should have had it in your second year, and if it's new, then maybe spend a few minutes to kind of go over it, but you don't need to memorize all of this. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to go through the next couple of slides fairly quickly, but they are important slides too, so go back and circle these as well. So if I have this descending pathway that I know is important, and it's the beginning of the placebo pathway, so the opioid pathway equals the placebo pathway, and if I have this belief system beginning in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and I have a neurodegenerative condition like Alzheimer's disease that targets the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, then you would expect that someone who originally had all the genetic markers for placebo but now is losing the circuit that controls placebo in Alzheimer's, they will start to lose the placebo effect. And in fact, that's actually been shown by a number of groups. The person who's taking the lead on this research is Benedetti and et al. And so when you look at individuals who originally, like today, they have Alzheimer's disease, but today they're doing pretty well in 2019. They come in, you give them a placebo, and they feel like, yeah, you know what, I actually feel like there's less pain. But you've given them a placebo. They have the placebo effect. Their dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that descending pathway, completely intact. Their belief system, you're in the doctor's office, expectation setting, all of that's working in their favor. They see a reduction in pain scores. And then they come back and visit you 1 year later. They get a cognitive test, which is known as the frontal assessment battery test. And you've seen that, wow, this person, their cognition is going down. And as their cognition and their frontal cortex is degenerating, so is their placebo response. And so we know that that pathway is important, and so we know that the degeneration of that pathway is going to be important as well. So this, again, lots of evidence to show that this circuit is actually very heavily involved. So again, we've talked about naloxone blocking this descending opioid pathway, the same pathway that we use for the placebo effect. So we block this, we block the opioid effect, and we can also block the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. If any of you are taking Psych 307 with Dr. Downer, he's sort of the Toronto area expert that uses transcranial magnetic stimulation. You can inhibit an area of the brain temporarily, a temporary lesion, by putting a large magnet over a precise area, and he can turn off or inhibit the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the very top of this descending pathway. And by doing so, you can block the placebo effect. I might have responded great yesterday, but after getting TMS today, given the same placebo by the same individual, no, that hurts today. Like, I actually feel more pain. Are you sure you gave me the right drug? So we know that these placebo effects are actually real. Okay, so the key question that I had asked earlier, and what we've been kind of circling around, is that humans have this belief system, expectancy, and other things that begin in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, especially to control levels of pain, and the placebo pathway works in the same way. It uses that same descending opioid pathway. And we can And each of those different synapses that you saw, it releases opioid, the normal endogenous opioids. We block the opioids with naloxone. We block that descending pain control pathway. And we know that that works. But do animals have that? Do animals trust you as a doctor? If you have like a white coat on, do they feel better than getting injected by a grad student wearing like a checkered shirt? Do they feel better, worse? Do they have the same belief system? And this was the key question. The group here at the front said yes, they definitely have a belief system. So do animals have a belief system? Yes. Yes, no. Okay. How would you prove it, which is the key thing? How do you prove that an animal has a belief system? You could ask it. They might not tell you, or they might not tell you in ways that you understand. What else could you do? Examine behavior. Okay, great. Good. 2019, scientists, awesome. What would you do to examine behavior? What behavior would you examine? It's a good answer. You need to expand on it. Any ideas? Yes. Social interactions. Okay, great. Social interactions, big part of like pain management, etc. So it's a complex behavioral action. So let's keep things simple. So let's go and test whether or not animals have this belief system. So if the theory of our arguments is correct, and it begins in the prefrontal cortex, and there's a belief system that has this descending pathway that releases opioids, etc., animals should also have this. They have a very similar brain, and they have very similar structures, but how do we actually fool an animal into believing that there's a placebo or not? They don't know, and like you would expect every animal to have sort of a placebo effect all the time. So this becomes a bit of an issue. So how do we design an animal study that interacts with this belief system that can actually be shown to examine this placebo effect? So we're going to try this in rats, and this is an operant-based pain assay for looking at placebo-induced analgesia. It makes sense. Analgesia is an area that Henry Beecher started in 1955. We've looked at the descending opioid pathway. Each of those different purple blobs, starting at the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex or cerebral cortex, releases opioid onto the next group of neurons, like the periaqueductal gray, which then in turn releases opioid onto the next group of neurons in the ventral medulla, then down to the spinal cord. All of that opioid release causes a reduction in pain. Placebo effect also uses the same pathway. How do we do that in mice? Or in rats? So there's a couple of things on this particular slide. Let me just get this up here. So here, the rats are given either PBS, which is sort of a phosphate buffered saline, so it's a neutral compound, or they're given morphine. Okay, so what they are taught to do is that they have these cages, and these cages have these bars that are associated with a temperature probe, and you can heat up the bars on the cage, and they want to stick their face up against it in order to get a food reward in the next sort of compartment. So they are putting their face up against these bars, and they want to get the food reward in the next compartment beside them, and you can heat up these bars so it becomes painful. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, so they have these bars, pain 56 degrees roughly, or 60 degrees, or 48 here, and this thermo temperature, they're trained first, like go up against the bars, get that food reward, then you start heating it up. They don't like it, so normally they'll spend less time up against the bars. And they spend less time, why? Because it's painful, it's noxious, it's a bad stimulus. It's painful for them to have a temperature probe at 48 degrees. So they learn, no, I don't like this, even though there's a food reward, I don't want that. What makes things less painful? Morphine, okay, or goldfish crackers, I guess. So if you give them morphine, they actually will spend more time up against the bar because they feel less pain. Does that make sense to everyone? So you do this several times. You get the animals to learn this task. So they're trained, they get conditioned to this task. Then you heat up the bars, so some of them don't like it anymore. And then some of those animals you give morphine, and then they feel less pain, so they stay on the bars longer, and you can measure the amount of time that they're staying on this. But here's the really interesting thing. You can start injecting some of these animals with morphine, where they are indeed feeling less pain because of the morphine, and then you can switch it. So they start off with morphine, they get an injection of morphine. Come here, little rats, you get your morphine injection today. Trust me, if you're a grad student, at some point you will talk to your rats, mice, zebrafish, Drosophila, I don't care, your C. elegans, whatever. You'll talk to them, and you inject them, right? And then they go up against the bars. And then you do that for 3 days, and then suddenly you switch. So you do PBS. There's no morphine in that syringe that you've given them. It's just an inactive substance. What do you think that animal is doing now? So now, this animal has a belief system that it's been getting an injection where it's felt less pain after the injection if they got morphine first. And so now they believe that they got that same injection. And so with PBS, they actually go up against the bars at the same level, even though they technically should still be feeling more pain. If you reverse that, if you do experiments where you start off with PBS, they draw back, and then if you give them morphine, then they start adjusting to it. But this is how we test the belief system of animals. They actually are still feeling pain, but they believe they're feeling less pain because of the earlier experiences, that expectancy of getting morphine first, which is sort of the second row, where morphine, and then they switch over to PBS. I can also do this experiment, and then you tell me if you understand the reason for this. What do you think this short form NLX is? Naloxone. So they get morphine first. They get morphine, they press their faces up against the bar. Now they get injections of naloxone. What do you think they will do? What do you predict? So they're getting an injection, but now they're getting an injection of naloxone. What do you expect them to do? Stay up against the bar the same length of time as before with morphine, or less? Less? Is everyone in agreement with that? Less?
No, they'll stay for the same amount of time.
Same amount of time? So no change? So you either have to believe that the opioid system and blocking the opioid system blocks the placebo effect or not, and in this case it does actually block the placebo. It actually makes them feel the pain stimulus. So they actually spend less time doing so. Do you have any questions on this before we wrap things up for today? Any things that you need to have clarified? Yes, Lauren, you had your hand up earlier. That's correct. So both effects are blocked by naloxone, both the morphine effect and the placebo effect. So any other questions? Yes. Okay, so a question that was asked, and it's probably related to the different SNPs that we talked about earlier. These are all genetically identical rats, so we know that their genetic background is identical, so they should be responding pretty consistently across species. So if any of you are on currently the no tonic, one of the things that you can answer for me on here as a note that goes forward through no tonic, did you understand this experiment related to how to test for placebo in rats? You just have to write a quick little sentence, yes, no, not clear, and how this experiment would work. So if you can go ahead and just type that in. We're just trying to see if we can use that to inform us about how to kind of go back and teach it the next day. So I will start off with this slide again, but some of your comments will help to inform what I discuss through that no tonic app. And next class is our last class. Is there anything special you want to do in our last class? Yes, Rena. So Rena was asking, what's the format of the final class? What do you guys want to do in the final class? There's still lecture material I need to get through, but outside of that, so that might be the first hour. Is there anything else you wanted to do in the second hour? Q&A. Will you have questions? Yes. Oh, okay. Yeah, Isis, Jeva. So would you guys also be amenable to having a review session in the second hour? Yeah? Okay. So bring your A game in the next class. We'll see if you bring your A game and you guys are on the ball. We'll sort of see if you get any questions from the final exam in advance during the review session. If you're not on your A game, you don't get it. So sorry about that. And we'll see you all in next class. Have a good week. Those of you doing posters, good luck on Thursday, Friday. Hello.